The blood on Quinn Taggert's hands wasn't his own, and that was the problem. He stood at the creek bed 40 miles north of Eureka Springs, Arkansas, scrubbing the crimson stains from his calloused palms while the autumn wind of 1878 bit through his buckskin shirt. The bear had come at him with no warning, all teeth and fury, and he'd put it down with his knife because his rifle had misfired. Now, the creature lay gutted 50 yards behind him, its meat already packed for the winter stores he kept in his mountain cabin. But it was the sounds the bear had made, the desperate animal sounds, that reminded him too much of screaming. Too much of his sister Mary's screams 11 years ago when the fever had taken her and her newborn boy both, leaving Quinn alone in a world that seemed determined to strip away everything soft. He was 32 years old and built like the mountains themselves, all corded muscle and hard angles from a life lived on the edge of civilization. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was thick enough to keep his face warm through the brutal Arkansas winters. His hands were scarred from 1,000 encounters with wilderness and violence, and his gray eyes had seen more death than any man should witness in 2 lifetimes. He lived alone because it was easier that way, because caring for something meant losing it eventually, and Quinn had learned that lesson too many times to count. The creek water ran clear again, and he dried his hands on his trousers before standing. The October sky was deepening toward twilight, and he needed to get the bear meat back to his cabin before the mountain lions caught the scent. He'd just turned to retrieve his pack when he heard it, the crack of a branch, too deliberate to be an animal, followed by labored breathing and the unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard not to make noise. Quinn's hand went to the hunting knife at his belt as he moved silently toward the tree line. Years of tracking had taught him how to place his feet without sound, how to become part of the forest itself. He circled around toward the source of the noise, keeping low, until he saw her. She was struggling through the underbrush about 30 yards from the creek, her movements clumsy and exhausted. Even from this distance, Quinn could see she was pregnant, her belly swollen beneath a torn and dirty dress that might have been blue once, but was now the color of mud and desperate travel. Her dark red hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangles around a face that was pale with fatigue and fear. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old, and she was clearly at the end of her strength. Quinn watched as she stumbled, caught herself against a pine tree, and stood there panting. Her free hand moved protectively to her belly, and something in that gesture hit Quinn like a physical blow. He stood frozen, memories flooding back unbidden. Mary with her hand on her own swollen stomach, laughing at something their mother had said. Mary in the cabin bed, fevered and afraid, while Quinn held her hand and lied that everything would be fine. Mary's baby boy, so tiny and perfect and already gone cold by the time Quinn had ridden back with the doctor. The woman moved again, and Quinn shook himself free of the past. She was heading in the wrong direction, deeper into the wilderness and away from anything resembling help or shelter. At the rate she was moving, she'd be dead by morning, either from exposure or from whatever was chasing her, because people didn't run into the mountains alone and pregnant unless something terrible was behind them. He should walk away. He should collect his bear meat and return to his cabin and let the world handle its own problems the way it always did. Quinn had learned long ago that getting involved with other people's troubles only led to heartache. But even as he thought it, he was moving forward, making just enough noise that she would hear him coming and not die of shock when he appeared. She spun toward him with a gasp, her green eyes wide with terror, and Quinn raised both hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy now," he said, keeping his voice low and calm the way he would with a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't look reassured. Her hand had gone to her dress pocket, and Quinn could see the outline of what was probably a small pistol or knife. Good for her. She should be armed. But she was swaying on her feet, and her face had gone even paler if that was possible. "You need to sit down before you fall down," Quinn said, taking a slow step forward. "There's a creek just through those trees. Water's clean and cold." "Stay back," she said, and her voice was hoarse, probably from lack of water and too much fear. "I have a gun." "I believe you," Quinn replied, "but you're about to collapse, and that won't be good for you or that baby. I've got supplies, food, and water. Let me help you." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for something. Quinn didn't know what she saw there, But slowly, incrementally, she seemed to decide he wasn't the worst threat she was facing. Her hand came away from her pocket, though he noticed she kept it close. "Who are you?" she asked. "Name's Quinn Taggert. I live up in these mountains. Hunt, trap, keep to myself mostly." He gestured back toward the creek. "That's my camp just beyond the water. I've got dried venison and cornbread if you're hungry." Her expression flickered at the mention of food, and Quinn knew he had her. She was starving. He could see it in the hollows of her cheeks and the desperate way she was trying not to look eager. "I'm Rose," she said finally. "Rose Jennings. And yes, I'm hungry." Quinn led her back to his makeshift camp by the creek, moving slowly to accommodate her exhausted pace. He'd built a small fire earlier to boil water for coffee, and it was still burning steadily. He spread out his bedroll for her to sit on, then crouched by his pack to retrieve food while she lowered herself carefully to the ground. Up close, he could see she was even worse off than he'd thought. Her dress was torn in several places. There were scratches on her arms and face from branches, and her shoes were barely holding together. But it was her hands that caught his attention. They were refined, soft, despite the recent ordeal, the hands of a woman who'd never done hard labor. Whatever she was running from, she hadn't been running long. He handed her a piece of cornbread and some dried venison, along with his canteen. She took them with shaking hands and had to visibly stop herself from devouring everything at once. Quinn busied himself with checking his gear to give her some privacy to eat, though he kept her in his peripheral vision in case she collapsed. "How far along are you?" he asked after a few minutes, his voice carefully neutral. Rose looked up from the food, her hand instinctively moving to her belly again. 7 months, she said quietly. "Maybe closer to 8 now. I've lost track of the days." 8 months pregnant and running through the mountains. Quinn felt anger stirring in his chest, though he wasn't sure who it was directed at. "Where were you heading?" "Anywhere," Rose said, and there was such exhaustion in her voice that Quinn knew she was telling the truth. "Just away. I thought if I could get far enough into the wilderness he wouldn't follow." He. So she was running from a man. Quinn had suspected as much. "Your husband?" Rose's laugh was bitter and entirely without humor. "Not exactly. Jacob Morton owns the general store in Eureka Springs. I was working for him, keeping house and helping in the store after my father died 6 months ago. He said he'd take care of me, said he'd marry me proper once I proved I could bear him a son." Her face hardened. "But he already has a wife in Little Rock. I found the letters. When I confronted him, he locked me in the cellar and said he'd take the baby once it was born and throw me out with nothing." Quinn's hands clenched involuntarily. He knew men like Jacob Morton, men who saw women and children as property to be used and discarded. He'd known plenty of them in his years as a tracker and hunter, taking on the occasional work guiding settlers or hunting down criminals for the law. Most of the criminals had been less vile than what Rose was describing. "How long ago did you run?" 3 days, I think, maybe 4. He was away in Little Rock, and his clerk was supposed to watch me, but he fell asleep drunk." Rose took another bite of cornbread, chewing slowly. "I took what food I could carry and started walking. I knew he'd come after me once he realized I was gone. The baby is all he wants." 3 or 4 days in the mountains, pregnant and alone. Quinn shook his head in amazement that she'd survived at all. "You were heading the wrong direction," he said. "Another day that way, and you'd have been into country with nothing but bears and mountain lions for company." "Better than Jacob Morton," Rose said flatly, and Quinn couldn't argue with that assessment. He studied her in the firelight, this woman who'd had the courage to run into the wilderness rather than submit to a man who'd treated her like livestock. There was steel in her spine despite her exhaustion, a determination in the set of her jaw that reminded him uncomfortably of his sister. Mary had been like that too, fierce and stubborn and unwilling to bend even when the world demanded it. "My cabin's about 6 miles from here," Quinn heard himself say, even though every instinct told him to keep his distance. "It's warm, secure, and far enough off any trails that Morton won't find it even if he's still looking. You can stay there until you figure out what to do next." Rose looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." It was a fair question, and Quinn wasn't entirely sure he knew the answer. He looked away from her, staring into the fire. "My sister died 11 years ago," he said finally. She was pregnant, caught a fever. Her husband had run off 6 months before, left her with nothing. I couldn't save her or the baby. He met Rose's eyes again. I can't change what happened to Mary, but I can make sure you don't die out here alone. The firelight reflected in Rose's eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she nodded slowly. Thank you, she whispered. I'll work for my keep. I'm a good cook when I have proper ingredients, and I can clean and mend clothes. I won't be a burden. You're 8 months pregnant, Quinn said gruffly. You're allowed to be a burden, but we need to leave at first light. Morton might have men searching these woods, and the sooner we're up the mountain, the safer you'll be. He insisted Rose sleep on his bedroll while he kept watch through the night. She protested, but was asleep within minutes of lying down, exhaustion finally claiming her completely. Quinn sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, listening to the sounds of the forest and the soft sound of her breathing. He tried not to think about how vulnerable she looked in sleep, or how his heart had twisted when he'd first seen her hand protectively over her belly. He tried not to think about anything at all except keeping watch and making sure nothing in the darkness came close to their camp. But thoughts came anyway, unwanted and insistent. He hadn't been close to another person in 11 years. He'd kept himself isolated deliberately, taking on only enough work to trade for supplies and spending the rest of his time in his cabin or ranging through the mountains. It was safer that way. Simpler. He'd convinced himself he preferred the solitude, that he'd moved past the grief and guilt that had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. Now, watching Rose sleep while her baby moved visibly beneath her worn dress, Quinn realized he'd been lying to himself. He hadn't moved past anything. He'd just buried it all under layers of isolation and emotional calluses. Dawn came cold and bright, burning off the mist that clung to the creek. Rose woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before memory caught up with her. Quinn had coffee boiling and more cornbread laid out, along with some wild berries he'd gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. "How are you feeling?" he asked as she sat up carefully. "Sore," Rose admitted, "but better than yesterday. Your bedroll was the first real rest I've had since I ran." They ate quickly, and Quinn packed up his camp with the efficient movements of long practice. He redistributed the bear meat in his pack to make room for his bedroll and supplies, then fashioned a walking stick from a sturdy branch for Rose. She accepted it gratefully, and they set out as the sun was fully clearing the eastern peaks. The journey to Quinn's cabin took most of the day. He kept the pace slow for Rose's sake, watching her carefully for signs that she was faltering. She pushed herself hard, clearly determined not to slow him down more than necessary, but by midday she was stumbling with fatigue. Quinn called a halt by a small spring, making her sit and drink water while he scouted ahead to make sure their trail was clear. "Tell me about your cabin," Rose said when he returned. She was rubbing her lower back with one hand, her face tight with discomfort. "Is it very isolated?" "Very," Quinn confirmed. "I built it 7 years ago in a box canyon with only one way in. There's a spring for water, good hunting all around, and enough flat land for a decent garden if I wanted to plant one. The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, and he's even more antisocial than I am." Rose smiled slightly at that. "It sounds perfect. Safe." "It is," Quinn said, "but it's also lonely. I'm not used to having company. I don't talk much." "That's all right," Rose said. "I'm not sure I remember how to have normal conversations anymore. Jacob kept me isolated, didn't want me talking to customers or making friends who might ask questions." The anger Quinn had felt the night before stirred again. He'd met men like Jacob Morton before, men who thought isolation made women easier to control. The fact that Morton had gotten away with it long enough to get Rose pregnant made Quinn's jaw clench. "He won't find you," he said, more to himself than to her. "I promise you that." They reached the cabin as the afternoon sun was slanting toward evening. Quinn's home was built of logs he'd cut and hauled himself, chinked tight against the winter winds and roofed with overlapping cedar shakes. It was a single large room with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, a loft above for sleeping, and windows with real glass that Quinn had packed up the mountain piece by careful piece. It wasn't much by civilized standards, but it was solid and well-built and more than adequate for one person. For 2 people, one of them heavily pregnant, it was going to be cozy. Rose stopped at the threshold, swaying slightly. Quinn dropped his pack and caught her elbow before she could fall. "Come on," he said gently. "You need to rest." He helped her inside and got her settled on the narrow bed in the corner while he built up the fire. The cabin was cold from his absence, but it warmed quickly once the flames were going. Quinn set water to boil and pulled out supplies to make a proper meal, something more substantial than trail food. He had venison steaks in his cold cellar, along with potatoes and carrots from a farmer he traded with. Rose needed real food and lots of it. While he cooked, he was acutely aware of her presence in his space. She was looking around the cabin with open curiosity, taking in the furs on the walls, his weapons carefully stored, the books on the shelf by the bed that were his one concession to civilized living. Quinn had always thought of his cabin as sufficient, functional. Now he saw it through her eyes and recognized how sparse it was, how masculine and bare of any softness. "You have books," Rose said, and there was such delight in her voice that Quinn glanced over in surprise. "I like to read," he said, feeling oddly defensive. "Got them from a trader passing through a few years back." "What kind of books?" Quinn shrugged. "Whatever he had. Some Shakespeare, some Dickens, a couple of westerns. Poetry." Rose's smile was genuine this time, transforming her tired face. "My father loved poetry. He used to read Whitman to me before bed when I was little." "I have some Whitman," Quinn offered. "You're welcome to read whatever you want." They fell into silence after that, but it felt companionable rather than awkward. Quinn finished cooking and served Rose a large portion of venison and vegetables. She ate with obvious appreciation, and he was gratified to see color returning to her cheeks. When she'd finished, he helped her up to the loft where he'd made up a bed with his spare blankets. It was more comfortable than the floor and offered some privacy. Where will you sleep?" Rose asked as he turned to descend the ladder. "Down here by the fire. I'm used to it." That wasn't entirely true, but Quinn wasn't about to displace a pregnant woman from the only real bed. He'd slept in worse places. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Quinn rose before dawn to tend to necessary work, chopping wood, checking his traps, hunting for fresh meat. Rose rested mostly, her body recovering from the ordeal of her flight and the advanced stage of her pregnancy. But she insisted on helping where she could, cooking meals that were far better than Quinn's rough bachelor fare, and mending his clothes with neat, precise stitches. Quinn found himself looking forward to returning to the cabin each day, to the smell of food cooking and the sight of Rose moving carefully around his space. She'd started reading his books in the afternoons, curled up in the chair he'd built from bent wood and deerskin. Sometimes she'd read passages aloud, and Quinn would listen while he worked on maintaining his gear or preparing hides. Her voice was soft and pleasant, and it filled the cabin with something Quinn hadn't realized was missing. He tried not to notice how beautiful she was as she recovered her strength, tried not to notice the way the firelight caught in her dark red hair, or how her green eyes sparkled when she laughed at something in a book, tried not to notice how his heart beat faster when she smiled at him, or how protective he felt when he thought about Jacob Morton or any other man who might try to hurt her. It had been so long since Quinn had let himself feel anything beyond basic survival needs that he didn't immediately recognize what was happening. The realization crept up on him slowly, over days of shared meals and quiet conversations and the simple comfort of another person's presence. He was falling for her. The thought terrified him. Quinn had built his entire life around avoiding exactly this kind of connection. He'd seen what loss could do, had felt it tear him apart when Mary died. He'd sworn he'd never put himself in that position again, never care about someone enough that losing them would destroy him. But Rose was already under his skin, already making him think about futures he'd given up imagining years ago. It was Rose who broke through his defenses completely about a week after her arrival. Quinn had been splitting wood in the clearing outside the cabin, working with the rhythmic meditative swing of the axe. The October air was crisp and cold, and he'd stripped down to just his undershirt despite the chill, his muscles warm from exertion. He was just setting up another log when he heard Rose gasp. He spun around, axe in hand, ready for danger. Rose was standing in the cabin doorway, one hand braced against the frame and the other clutched to her belly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Quinn dropped the axe and crossed the distance in 3 long strides. "What is it? Is it the baby?" Rose shook her head, and to his surprise she was smiling even though there were tears on her cheeks. "He's kicking," she said. "Really hard. I think he's angry I walked too far today." She reached out without thinking, and caught Quinn's hand, pressing it against the side of her swollen belly. "Can you feel it?" Quinn froze, his hand warm against the fabric of her dress. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. And then it happened. A strong, unmistakable thump against his palm. The baby moved again, rolling or kicking. Quinn couldn't tell which, but it was alive and real and right there under his hand. Something inside Quinn's chest cracked open. He hadn't held a baby since Mary's boy, hadn't let himself get anywhere near a pregnant woman or a child because the memories were too painful. But this was different. This baby was alive, strong, fighting to be born. And Rose was here, warm and solid under his touch, not fevered and dying, but healthy and smiling through her tears. "He's strong," Quinn managed, his voice rough. "She," Rose corrected softly. "I think it's a girl. I don't know why, but I just feel it." Quinn's eyes met hers, and something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them had words for. His hand was still on her belly, and Rose's hand was over his, and they stood like that in the doorway while the baby moved between them, and the autumn wind whispered through the pines. "Quinn," Rose said quietly, "why did you really bring me here?" He should have lied. He should have said something about basic human decency or Christian charity or any of a dozen acceptable answers. Instead, he told her the truth. "Because the thought of you dying out there made me feel something I thought I'd buried 11 years ago. Because you were brave and scared and doing everything you could to protect your baby, and I remembered what that looked like. Because I'm tired of being alone." Rose's eyes searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her lean forward slightly. Quinn was acutely aware that they were standing very close, that her face was tilted up toward his, that it would take almost nothing to close the distance between them. He could smell the soap she'd used to wash her hair, could see the faint freckles across her nose, could feel the warmth of her breath. "I'm tired of being alone, too," Rose whispered, "and I'm tired of being afraid. When I'm with you, I feel safe for the first time in months." Quinn knew he should step back. She was vulnerable, pregnant, dependent on him for her survival. Taking advantage of that would make him no better than Jacob Morton. But Rose was the one who moved, who rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of all the things neither of them knew how to say. Quinn's free hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking along her cheekbone. The kiss deepened, though he was careful to be gentle, mindful of her condition and her recent ordeal. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "This is a bad idea," he said, though his hand was still on her belly and he made no move to pull away. "Probably," Rose agreed, "but I don't care. I've spent the last 6 months making decisions based on what other people wanted or what was safe or proper. For once, I want to do something because it feels right." "And this feels right?" Quinn asked. Rose's smile was radiant. "You feel right. More right than anything has in a very long time." They stood like that for a long moment, the baby moving between them like a seal on a promise neither of them had made yet. Then Quinn kissed her again, slow and thorough, pouring into it all the things he didn't have words for. The loneliness of 11 years alone, the fear of losing someone he cared about, the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could have something good again. The next few weeks passed in a haze of discovery. Quinn taught Rose about the mountains, showing her how to read the weather in the clouds and identify edible plants. Rose brought warmth and laughter back into Quinn's life, teasing him when he got too serious and reading to him in the evenings while he worked on winter preparations. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. Rose's childhood in a small town in Missouri, Quinn's years as a tracker before he'd retreated to the mountains, their dreams and fears and all the broken pieces they'd both been carrying. Quinn found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. He told Rose about Mary, about the guilt he still carried for not being there when she got sick. Rose listened without judgment, her hand in his, and when he was done, she told him about her father's death, about the desperation that had driven her into Jacob Morton's trap, and the shame she'd felt when she'd realized what he really wanted from her. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Quinn said fiercely. "He took advantage of you when you were vulnerable. That's on him, not you." "I know that in my head," Rose said quietly. "But knowing and feeling are different things. Sometimes I still feel stupid for not seeing it sooner." Quinn pulled her close, careful of her belly between them. "You're one of the smartest, bravest people I've ever met. You're surviving something that would have broken most people. Never forget that." As Rose's belly grew larger and the baby's movements became more visible, Quinn found his terror matching pace with his wonder. He'd lost Mary and her baby. What if something went wrong? What if Rose got sick, or the baby came too early, or any of 100 complications that could happen even with a doctor present? Out here, 40 miles from the nearest town and much farther from any real medical help, they were completely on their own. Rose seemed to sense his fear without him saying anything. One evening as they sat by the fire, his hand on her belly as had become their habit, she turned to him with serious eyes. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Quinn said without hesitation. "If something goes wrong when the baby comes, if you have to choose, you save the baby. Promise me." "No," Quinn said flatly. "I'm not promising that." "Quinn." "No," he repeated, his voice hard. "I won't lose you. I can't. I just found you, Rose. I'm not going to sit here and promise to let you die." Rose's eyes filled with tears. "But the baby. We'll need her mother," Quinn finished. "I know birth is dangerous. I know things can go wrong. But I also know you're strong, and I'll do everything I can to keep you both safe. I'm not choosing between you. I refuse." Rose leaned her head against his shoulder, and Quinn felt her tears soak through his shirt. "I'm so scared," she whispered. "What if I can't do this? What if I'm not strong enough?" "You are," Quinn said with absolute certainty. "You walked for 4 days through the mountains alone to save your baby. You're strong enough for anything." The first snow came in mid-November, dusting the peaks white and turning the air sharp as crystal. Quinn had been preparing for winter for weeks, stocking the cold cellar with meat and vegetables, cutting enough firewood to last through until spring, and checking and rechecking all the cabin's defenses against weather and predators. Rose was 9 months pregnant now, her belly enormous, her movements slow and careful. She spent most of her time in the cabin, resting and preparing the few baby things they had: cloth for diapers cut from Quinn's spare shirts, a cradle he'd built from pine wood and lined with soft furs, tiny clothes sewn from whatever fabric they could spare. Quinn had never been so aware of time passing. Every day without the baby coming was a relief and a new source of anxiety. Rose was healthy, that was clear, but she was also getting uncomfortable and tired. The baby was active, moving constantly, and Quinn would watch Rose's belly shift and roll with a mixture of awe and terror. It was a cold night in late November when Rose woke Quinn with a hand on his shoulder. He was awake instantly, years of light sleeping in dangerous country making him alert. "What is it?" "I think it's time," Rose said, and even in the darkness he could hear the fear in her voice. "The pain started a few hours ago. They're getting closer together." Quinn's heart kicked into a gallop. This was it. This was what they'd been preparing for and dreading in equal measure. He got up and built up the fire until the cabin was bright and warm, then helped Rose down from the loft. She moved slowly, pausing every few minutes to breathe through contractions that made her face tighten with pain. Quinn had helped birth foals and calves, had even assisted once when a tracker he was traveling with had his wife go into labor in the middle of nowhere. But this was Rose, and his hands shook as he gathered the supplies they'd prepared: clean cloths, boiled water, a sharp knife in case it was needed. Rose had found a book about childbirth among Quinn's collection, a medical text that was outdated but better than nothing, and they'd read it together multiple times. Quinn desperately wished for a doctor, for his mother who'd been a midwife, for anyone with more experience than he had. But there was no one. Just him and Rose and the baby fighting to be born. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Quinn stayed by Rose's side the entire time, letting her grip his hands hard enough to leave bruises, wiping her face with cool cloths, talking to her in a steady stream of encouragement even when she was too deep in pain to respond. He'd never felt so helpless in his life. This wasn't a threat he could fight with a knife or a rifle. All he could do was be there, support Rose, and trust that her body knew what to do. Rose was incredible. Even through the pain, even as the hours stretched on and exhaustion set in, she didn't give up. She followed the instructions from the medical book, changing positions when Quinn suggested it, breathing through contractions, saving her strength for when it was needed. And when the final stage came, when she had to push with everything she had left, she did it with a fierce determination that made Quinn's heart swell with admiration and love. The baby came into the world with a lusty cry, just as the sun was setting on the second day. Quinn caught her, this tiny, slippery, perfect creature, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. She was so small, so fragile, her skin red and wrinkled and beautiful. He'd been right to be terrified. This little life was so vulnerable, so dependent on them for everything. "Is she all right?" Rose asked, her voice exhausted but urgent. "Please, Quinn, is the baby okay?" "She's perfect," Quinn managed, his voice thick with emotion. He cleaned the baby quickly with the warm water, tied off the cord the way the book had shown, and wrapped her in soft cloth before placing her on Rose's chest. "You were right. It's a girl." Rose's face transformed as she looked down at her daughter. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she was smiling, her exhaustion forgotten in the wonder of meeting her baby. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm your mama. I've been waiting so long to meet you." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of Rose's voice, and Quinn watched as tiny eyes tried to focus on her mother's face. His throat was tight, his own eyes burning with tears he didn't try to hide. He'd been so afraid of this moment, so certain it would bring back all the pain of losing Mary. And there was pain, grief for what he'd lost all those years ago, but there was also joy, pure and overwhelming, at what was here now. This baby was alive. Rose was alive. They'd made it through. "She needs a name," Rose said softly, stroking the baby's dark hair. "I was thinking, if it's all right with you, I'd like to call her Mary, after your sister." Quinn's breath caught. He reached out with one scarred, work-roughened hand and gently touched the baby's cheek. She was so soft, so warm. "Mary," he said. "That's perfect." He helped Rose get comfortable, making sure both she and the baby were warm and clean. The medical book had more instructions about what came after the birth, and Quinn followed them carefully, making sure Rose was recovering properly and the bleeding was normal. She was exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open, but she wouldn't let go of baby Mary. "You should rest," Quinn said gently. "I'll watch her. I promise I won't let anything happen." Rose looked up at him with so much trust it made his chest ache. "I know you won't. You're going to be an amazing father." Father. The word hit Quinn like a physical blow. He wasn't Mary's father, not by blood. But looking at this tiny baby, at Rose's exhausted, happy face, Quinn realized it didn't matter. He'd chosen them, and they'd chosen him, and that was enough. More than enough. He took Mary carefully when Rose's eyes finally closed in sleep, cradling the baby against his broad chest. She was so small in his arms, so light it was almost frightening. But she was also warm and real and alive, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Quinn sat in his chair by the fire, the baby secure in his arms, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back for 11 years, the grief, the fear, the loneliness, and now, finally, the hope. "I've got you," he whispered to Mary. "Both of you. I promise I'll keep you safe. I promise I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere." The baby made a small sound, almost like a sigh, and settled more deeply into sleep. Quinn held her through the night, watching the fire burn down and listening to Rose's steady breathing from the bed. He'd thought his life was over when Mary died, that he'd never be anything but alone and closed off. But here he was, holding a baby named for his sister, protecting a woman he'd fallen impossibly in love with, and feeling more alive than he had in over a decade. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, Quinn finally allowed himself to believe they might actually have a future, a real one, together, as a family. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. The winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin it was warm. Rose recovered from the birth with remarkable speed, her strength returning day by day. Baby Mary was healthy and hungry, eating constantly and growing visibly. Quinn found himself utterly captivated by her, by the tiny faces she made, and the way her little fists waved in the air, and the soft sounds of her breathing when she slept. He'd been so afraid of holding a baby again, so certain it would break him. But Mary's tiny weight in his arms was healing rather than painful. Every time he held her, fed her from a bottle when Rose needed rest, changed her and soothed her when she cried, Quinn felt another piece of his broken heart mend. This baby was teaching him something he'd forgotten, that love didn't have to end in loss, that opening yourself up to caring was worth the risk. Rose watched him with Mary, and the love in her eyes made Quinn's breath catch. They hadn't talked about the future, about what came next or what they were to each other. They'd been too focused on survival, on getting through the pregnancy and birth. But now, in the quiet winter days with snow piling high outside and the three of them safe and warm inside, it was time to have that conversation. Quinn waited until Mary was asleep in her cradle and Rose was resting on the bed, her body still recovering. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Rose's expression grew wary. "That sounds ominous." "Not ominous," Quinn assured her. "Just important. Rose, what do you want, for the future, I mean? When winter breaks and the pass is clear, do you want to go back to Eureka Springs? Try to start over somewhere else? I need to know what you're thinking." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on their joined hands. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want you to stay," Quinn said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Both of you. Here, with me. I know it's not much, just a cabin in the mountains and a man who doesn't talk much and probably doesn't know the first thing about being a father. But I love you, Rose. I love you and Mary both, and I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You love me?" "More than I thought I could love anything," Quinn said roughly. "You made me feel again when I thought I was dead inside. You and Mary, you're everything. You're my whole world now." Rose reached up and cupped his bearded face with one hand. "I love you too. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you'd think it was just gratitude or dependence." She laughed, the sound watery but happy. "But it's not. It's real. You're the best man I've ever known, Quinn Taggert, and I want to stay here with you more than anything." Quinn kissed her then, deep and thorough, trying to pour into it all the love and hope he was feeling. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he said, "properly, when we can get to a preacher. I want you to be my wife. I want to give Mary my name. I want us to be a real family." "Yes," Rose whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." They spent the rest of the winter planning their future. Quinn talked about expanding the cabin, adding another room for Mary and maybe more children if they were blessed with them. Rose talked about planting a real garden in the spring, about maybe getting some chickens and a goat for milk. They read to each other in the evenings, Quinn's deep voice and Rose's softer one, taking turns with passages from books. They took care of Mary together, sharing the duties of parenthood with an ease that surprised them both. And at night, after Mary was asleep and the cabin was quiet, they would lie together in the narrow bed and hold each other, talking in whispers about dreams and fears and all the small details of their days. Quinn had never been happier. The loneliness that had defined his life for so long was completely gone, replaced by the constant warm presence of people he loved. When spring finally came, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes, Quinn rode down to Eureka Springs. He went alone, leaving Rose and Mary safe in the cabin, because he had business to attend to. He stopped first at the church, where he spoke with Reverend Thomas about performing a marriage ceremony. The Reverend was a good man, older and understanding, and he agreed to make the trip up to Quinn's cabin when the trails were fully clear. Then Quinn went to the general store. Jacob Morton was behind the counter, older than Quinn had expected, running to fat and with mean eyes. Quinn didn't announce himself, just walked up and leaned against the counter until Morton looked up from his ledger. "Help you?" Morton asked, his tone dismissive. "Rose Jennings sends her regards," Quinn said quietly, and watched Morton's face go pale. "She wanted you to know she's doing just fine. Got a healthy baby girl, matter of fact. And she's marrying a man who actually respects her, so you can stop looking." Morton's hands clenched on his ledger. "That woman stole from me. She owes me—" "She doesn't owe you anything," Quinn interrupted, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "And if you ever come looking for her, if you ever try to claim her baby or bother her in any way, I'll make sure you regret it. Are we clear?" There must have been something in Quinn's face, in his tone, that convinced Morton he wasn't bluffing. The storekeeper's bluster collapsed. Fine. She wasn't worth the trouble anyway. Quinn had to physically restrain himself from violence. Morton wasn't worth it, wasn't worth the trouble it would cause or the stain on his conscience. Instead, he pushed away from the counter and walked out of the store, his business concluded. Rose was free. Morton wouldn't come after her. They could build their future without that shadow hanging over them. The ride back up the mountain took most of the day, and Quinn was grinning like a fool by the time he saw his cabin in the distance. Rose must have been watching for him because she appeared in the doorway as he was dismounting, Mary in her arms. The sight of them, his woman and his daughter waiting for him to come home, made Quinn's heart swell. "How did it go?" Rose asked as he climbed the steps to the porch. "Morton won't bother us," Quinn said. He wrapped his arms around both of them, careful of the baby, and kissed Rose soundly. "And Reverend Thomas is coming up in 2 weeks to marry us." Rose's smile was radiant. 2 weeks. I can hardly believe it's real." "It's real," Quinn assured her. "All of this is real. You, me, Mary, our life together. It's the most real thing I've ever known." The wedding was simple, held in front of the cabin with the Reverend Rose, Quinn, and baby Mary as the only witnesses. Rose wore a dress she'd made from fabric Quinn had bought in town, simple but beautiful, and Quinn wore his best shirt and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. They spoke their vows with the mountains rising around them and the spring sun warm on their faces, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed Rose with all the love in his heart. Mary, held in a sling against Rose's chest, made a small sound of protest at being squished between them, and they broke apart laughing. "Welcome to married life," Rose said, her eyes sparkling with joy. "Best decision I ever made," Quinn replied. The Reverend stayed for dinner, then headed back down the mountain as the sun was setting. Quinn and Rose stood together on the porch, watching him go, Rose leaning back against Quinn's broad chest while his arms wrapped around her and Mary both. "Are you happy?" Quinn asked quietly. "Happier than I've ever been," Rose said. "You saved my life, Quinn, both our lives, and you gave us a home, a family. How could I be anything but happy?" Quinn pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You saved me too. I was just existing before you came along, not really living. You and Mary, you gave me a reason to care again, a reason to hope." They stood like that as darkness fell, the three of them together under the vast Montana sky. Inside the cabin, a fire was burning, keeping their home warm and bright. Tomorrow Quinn would check his traps and Rose would tend her garden and Mary would continue growing and learning. There would be hard days ahead, Quinn knew. Living in the mountains was never easy, and raising a child came with its own challenges. But they would face it together, as a family, and that made all the difference. The years passed with the kind of quiet contentment Quinn had never imagined for himself. Mary grew from a tiny baby into a curious toddler, then a bright-eyed child who followed Quinn everywhere and helped Rose in the garden. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, though Quinn was the only father she'd ever known. He'd formally adopted her, making her Mary Taggert in the eyes of the law, and she called him Papa with an ease that still made his heart squeeze. When Mary was 3, Rose got pregnant again. This time there was no fear, no running, just joy and anticipation. Quinn was still nervous about the birth, his memories of his sister never fully fading, but Rose's first labor had been successful, and there was no reason to think this one would be different. Still, he rode down to Eureka Springs and arranged for a midwife to come stay with them for the last month of the pregnancy, just to be safe. The second baby came easier than the first, a boy this time, strong, lunged, and healthy. They named him Samuel, after Quinn's father, and he was the spitting image of Quinn even as an infant, all serious expressions and dark gray eyes. Mary was fascinated by her baby brother, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding. Quinn had expanded the cabin over the years, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen for Rose. They had chickens now and a cow for milk, and Rose's garden produced enough vegetables to last through the winter with plenty to spare. Quinn still hunted and trapped, providing meat and furs to trade in town for things they couldn't make themselves. It was a good life, a hard life, but one filled with love and laughter and the simple satisfaction of working toward a common goal. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the cabin was peaceful, Quinn and Rose would sit together by the fire. Sometimes they'd read, sometimes they'd just talk. And sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, Rose leaning against Quinn's side while his arm wrapped around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose asked one night, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "Giving up your solitude for all this chaos?" Quinn smiled into her hair. "Not for a single second. Before you I was just surviving, waiting for time to pass. Now I'm living. You and the children, you're everything I never knew I needed." "I feel the same way," Rose said softly. "When I was running through those mountains, terrified and alone, I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe again. But you gave me that. You gave me a home and a family and love. You gave me everything." Quinn tilted her face up and kissed her gently. "We gave each other everything. That's what makes it work." When Mary was 6 and Samuel was 3, Rose got pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 more boys who came into the world squalling and demanding attention. They named them James and Joseph, and the cabin that had once been too big for just Quinn suddenly felt very full indeed. 4 children meant constant noise, constant activity, constant work. But it also meant laughter ringing through the mountains, meant Quinn teaching his sons to hunt and his daughter to track, meant Rose surrounded by the family she'd always dreamed of. Quinn was 43 years old, his beard now streaked with gray, and his body bearing the accumulated scars of years in the wilderness, but he'd never been stronger or more content. Every morning he woke up next to his wife, listened to his children stirring in their rooms, and thanked whatever force had sent Rose stumbling into his life all those years ago. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he'd think about the man he used to be, bitter, closed off, certain he'd die alone in these mountains. That man felt like a stranger now. Quinn couldn't imagine life without Rose's warm presence beside him, without Mary's curious questions, without Samuel's serious focus, or the twins' endless energy. His family had become the center of his world, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Rose had changed too. The frightened, desperate woman who'd run into the wilderness had transformed into a confident, capable mother and wife. She ran their household with easy efficiency, taught the children their letters and numbers, and somehow still found time to work on her sewing or read or tend her ever-expanding garden. She was beautiful, Quinn thought, more beautiful now than she'd been at 22. The years had added laugh lines around her eyes and a few silver threads in her dark red hair, but they'd also added confidence and strength and a deep, abiding happiness that made her glow. "I love you," Quinn said one evening, the words coming out of nowhere as they often did now. After 11 years of marriage, he still couldn't go more than a few days without telling her. Rose looked up from the shirt she was mending, her eyes soft. "I love you too, always." The children grew, as children do. Mary developed a love for reading that rivaled Quinn's own, and she could often be found curled up with a book in the loft, oblivious to the chaos below. Samuel was quieter, more serious, but he had a gift for tracking, and could follow a trail that Quinn himself would have struggled with. The twins were hellions, always getting into trouble, but with such infectious joy that it was hard to stay mad at them for long. Quinn taught them all the skills they'd need to survive in the mountains: hunting, tracking, reading weather, finding water, building shelter. Rose taught them reading and writing, basic arithmetic, history. From the books Quinn brought back from his trips to town, they grew up wild and free, climbing trees and swimming in the creek and learning the mountains the way most children learned city streets. But they also grew up loved deeply and completely. Quinn and Rose made sure their children knew every day that they were wanted, that they were cherished, that they had a home and a family that would always be there for them. Quinn, remembering his own lonely years, was determined that his children would never feel abandoned or alone. And Rose, remembering her own desperation, made sure her children knew they always had options, always had choices, always had somewhere safe to come home to. On Mary's 18th birthday, Quinn took her aside for a private conversation. She was a woman now, tall and confident, with her mother's beauty and her father's determination. Quinn had been dreading this conversation for months, but it needed to happen. "You're grown now," he said quietly, the two of them sitting on the porch while the rest of the family was inside preparing for the birthday dinner. old enough to make your own choices about your life. Your mama and I, we want you to know you have options. If you want to go to school in Little Rock, or travel, or see more of the world than just these mountains, we'll support you. We've been saving money, and we'll make sure you have what you need." Mary looked at him with surprise, then with love. "Papa, I'm not going anywhere. This is my home. These mountains, this family, this is where I belong. Maybe someday I'll travel, see some of those places we've read about in books, but this will always be home, and I'll always come back." Quinn felt his throat tighten. He'd raised his daughter to be independent, to have choices, but hearing her choose to stay still filled him with profound gratitude. "You're sure? You're not staying just because you think it's what we want?" "I'm staying because it's what I want," Mary said firmly. "Besides, someone needs to help keep the twins from burning down the forest." Quinn laughed and pulled his daughter into a hug. "Your mama and I are proud of you, so proud. You've grown into an amazing woman, Mary." "I had good teachers," Mary said, hugging him back just as hard. That evening, as Quinn watched his family gathered around the table for Mary's birthday dinner, he felt a sense of completion he'd never experienced before. This was what life was supposed to be about: family, love, connection, not the isolated, lonely existence he'd been living before Rose stumbled into his world. She'd saved him just as surely as he'd saved her, and together they'd built something beautiful. Rose caught his eye across the table and smiled, and Quinn smiled back. 18 years of marriage, and she still made his heart beat faster. 18 years of family, and he still woke up grateful every single day for the gift he'd been given. The twins were arguing about something, their voices rising until Rose shushed them with a look. Samuel was helping serve the food, careful and precise as always. Mary was laughing at something her mother had said, her whole face lit up with joy. This was Quinn's world now, loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. After dinner, when the children had scattered to various activities and Rose was cleaning up in the kitchen, Quinn found himself standing on the porch again, looking out at the mountains he'd called home for so long. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was warm with the promise of summer. Rose joined him a few minutes later, slipping her hand into his and leaning against his shoulder. They stood like that in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Do you remember the night we met?" Rose asked eventually. "When you found me stumbling through those trees, terrified and pregnant and completely lost?" "I remember," Quinn said. "I remember thinking I should walk away, that getting involved would only lead to pain. I remember how you put your hand on your belly, trying to protect your baby, even though you were exhausted and scared. And I remember how something inside me just broke open when I saw that." "I was so afraid of you at first," Rose admitted, "this huge, intimidating mountain man appearing out of nowhere. But then you offered me food and water, and you looked at me like I was a person worth helping, not just a problem to be solved. That's when I started to hope again." Quinn turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "You gave me back my life, Rose. I was dead inside before you came along, just going through the motions. You and Mary and then Samuel and the twins. You made me whole again. You taught me how to love again, how to hope again. Everything good in my life started the day I found you in those mountains." Rose's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "We saved each other. That's what love is, I think. Saving each other over and over again, in all the small and large ways that matter." Quinn kissed her as the stars came out above them, as the mountains stood eternal around them, as their family moved and laughed and lived inside the cabin they'd built together. This was home. This was love. This was everything he'd never known he was searching for, delivered to him in the form of a desperate pregnant woman running through the wilderness. He'd been so afraid to hold a baby again after losing his sister's boy. But Rose's pregnancy, her swollen belly, had made him soft as clay, molding him into someone new, someone better, someone capable of love and family and all the things he'd thought he'd lost forever. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Mary eventually did meet someone, a young man from Eureka Springs, who came up to the mountain to study the wildlife and fell in love with Quinn's fierce, intelligent daughter. Quinn approved of him, which was saying something, and the two were married in front of the cabin just as Quinn and Rose had been, continuing the tradition. Samuel became a tracker like his father, ranging through the mountains and developing a reputation as one of the best in Arkansas. He'd bring his earnings home to help support the family, though Quinn insisted he keep most of it for himself. The twins eventually settled down, more or less, and found work helping with a ranch on the far side of Eureka Springs. They'd come home regularly, filling the cabin with noise and laughter and stories of their adventures. Through it all, Quinn and Rose remained the center of their family's universe. They grew older together, their hair graying and their bodies slowing, but their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, deepened by shared experiences and the life they'd built together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Rose back to the creek where he'd first found her. It was summer, the woods green and lush, the water cold and clear. They sat together on the bank, holding hands, remembering. "I was so lost that day," Rose said softly, "in every possible way. Lost in the mountains, lost in my life, lost in despair. And then you appeared, like something out of a story, and everything changed." "I was lost too," Quinn replied. "I just didn't know it. I thought I was content, but I was really just hiding. You found me, Rose, just as much as I found you." Rose leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting against him as perfectly as she had 25 years ago. "We found each other, and we built something beautiful." "The most beautiful thing I've ever known," Quinn agreed. He looked around at the mountains, at the creek, at the forest that had been his home for so long. This place used to feel empty. Now it feels full, full of memories, full of love, full of life. All because of you. They sat by the creek until the sun began to set, talking about their children and grandchildren, about the life they'd built and the future that stretched ahead. And when they finally stood to make the walk back to their cabin, Quinn pulled Rose close and kissed her one more time in the place where their story had begun. The cabin was waiting for them, smoke rising from the chimney, lights glowing warm in the windows. Some of their children and grandchildren were visiting, and Quinn could hear the sounds of family as they approached. Laughter, conversation, the clatter of dishes being prepared for supper. This was his legacy, Quinn thought, as he and Rose walked hand in hand toward home. Not the furs he'd trapped, or the game he'd hunted, or the reputation he'd built as a mountain man. His legacy was this family, these people who loved each other and supported each other, and would carry that love forward into the future. He'd been so afraid to hold a baby again after losing his sister's boy. But Rose's pregnant belly, the gentle swell of new life, had made him soft as clay. Had remolded him into a man capable of opening his heart again, of taking the risk of loving even knowing it could lead to loss. And it had been worth it. Every moment of fear, every risk, every vulnerable moment when he'd opened himself up to being hurt again, it had all been worth it for this. For Rose sleeping beside him every night, for his children and grandchildren filling his cabin with life, for the knowledge that he hadn't died alone and bitter in these mountains, but had instead built something that would outlast him, something good and true and worth the building. As they climbed the steps to the porch, Mary appeared in the doorway, her own baby on her hip now. "There you are. We were starting to worry. Dinner's almost ready." "We're here," Quinn said, unable to keep the smile off his face. "We're home." And they were. They were home, surrounded by family, held safe by love that had started with a desperate woman running through the mountains and a lonely man who'd found the courage to help her. They were home, and they always would be. Inside the cabin, the family gathered for dinner, crowding around the table that Quinn had built years ago. There wasn't quite enough room, so the younger children sat on the floor with their plates, treating it like an adventure. Rose moved through the chaos with practiced ease, making sure everyone had food and drink, accepting hugs and kisses from grandchildren who adored her. Quinn stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. His family, his home, his life. Everything he'd never known he wanted, everything he'd been too afraid to reach for, all right here in this room. Samuel noticed him standing there and raised his cup. A toast to Ma and Pa, 25 years married and still making it look easy. "It wasn't always easy," Rose said, but she was smiling as she moved to stand beside Quinn. "But it was always worth it." Quinn wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders and raised his own cup. to family, to love, to second chances and new beginnings, and to this beautiful woman who saved my life by letting me save hers. To Ma and Pa, the family chorused, and the cabin rang with their voices. That night, after everyone had eaten and the dishes were cleaned and the visiting family had settled into makeshift beds around the cabin, Quinn and Rose lay in their own bed in the room they'd shared for 25 years. Rose's head was on Quinn's chest, her hand resting over his heart, and his arm was around her shoulders. "Thank you," Quinn said into the darkness. "For what?" Rose asked sleepily. "For everything. For trusting me when you had no reason to, for choosing to stay, for giving me a family, for loving me even when I was too scared to admit I loved you back, for every day of the last 25 years. Rose raised her head to look at him, her eyes gleaming in the moonlight that filtered through the window. "You don't have to thank me for any of that. Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. You're a good man, Quinn Taggert, the best man I've ever known, and I'd choose you again every single time." Quinn pulled her close and kissed her, deep and slow and full of 25 years of love and devotion. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'd choose you too. Every time, without hesitation. You're my whole world, Rose. You always have been." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, while their family slept safe around them and the mountains stood watch outside. The man who'd been too afraid to hold a baby, who'd run from connection and buried himself in the wilderness, was gone. In his place was Quinn Taggert, husband, father, grandfather, and the luckiest man in the world. The pregnant belly that had terrified him, that had made him remember all his losses and fear all the new ones, had instead given him back his life, had made him soft as clay, yes, but in being soft, he'd found strength he'd never known he possessed, the strength to love again, the strength to hope again, the strength to build something that would last long after he was gone. And as he drifted off to sleep with his wife in his arms and his family safe around him, Quinn knew with absolute certainty that every moment of fear, every risk, every vulnerable step toward love had been worth it. This was what life was supposed to be. This was what he'd been searching for without even knowing it. This was home.